the signatures reaffirm our to the decision of the executive of President Juan Orlando Fernandez in the strengthening of relations, diplomatic relations with Israel, and his decision to change the embassy in Honduras to Jerusalem. We also, like all the institutions, national and international, that should not permit that some governments promote, finance, and facilitate any act of terrorism that permits the capacity of nuclear armament, also the means to create him or to utilize him. The governments of the Occidental Hemisphere, we work together in our efforts for the defense of the values that unite us, being this liberty, democracy, human rights, the combat and eradication of all forms of terrorism. This was signed in 24th of November 2020, and it was organized by the Deputy of Congress of the Republic of Honduras.
Solo recordar que el 2018 el Congreso aprobó la moción para apoyar al Ejecutivo a trasladar la embajada a Jerusalén. 2020 firmamos este acuerdo de solidaridad con Israel y la embajada se trasladó en junio del año anterior.
I should say that in 2018 there was a first resolution passed. This one was signed by, and it's actually signed by all the deputies involved on 2020, and then posterior to that, the embassy was translated from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Y estamos listos esperando a Leopoldo este año para poder reafirmar una nueva declaración los nuevos diputados de este Congreso con Israel.
And we're waiting for the new Congress to take a seat this year to reaffirm the same declaration again.
Amen. Well, thank you so much. Sammy, can you bring that up here for us? Can you bring the actual document? Thank you. So, Mr. Minister, as you see, we see a lot of fruits of the labor of faith-based diplomacy, and a lot of world leaders around the world are understanding the importance of this gathering, and we'd like to present this to you as a minister in the government on behalf of the State of Israel. So.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize for being late. It's not like me as a pilot. Since the day I started working in Jerusalem, I haven't met such a bad traffic until today. So I apologize for this. Second of all, I want to thank you for your generosity of letting me speak before you. Thank you. And no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And third, I want to apologize for my English. If you think that you speak Hebrew better than my English, tell me now, and I will switch to Hebrew. No. Okay, so we will continue in English. I was asked to speak with you about the unique situation in Israel about the relationship between state and religious. As you know, Israel is a country who is Jewish and democratic. We are standing on those two very important pillars. But if you take the interpretation of these two values to the edge, from time to time there are clashes between them. So I want to start with some kind of story. As I told you before, I was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and friends of mine who is he's secular. Most of the pilots in Israel are secular, unfortunately. And not that he's secular, he is atheist. Totally atheist, okay? There are some kinds of those people too. And he is, you know what is Kohen? He's some kind of priest. He's from the caste. in the Judaism, there are people who are Kohen is like a priest, okay? So you heritage it from your fathers and grandfathers and so on, and he is a Kohen. It means that he is more one of the castes that are more close to God. And those guys cannot marry a divorced woman. So this, my friend, telling me, he says me, Matan, look what you're doing to me. You tell me that there is a God that I don't believe about his existence. Not that you're telling me that there is a God, that I'm not believing in him. You tell me that I am his priest, okay? And not so that you're telling me that I am the priest of gods that don't exist. You tell me that because of this, I cannot marry my girlfriend, that she is divorced. So you have to know that in Israel, the only the only way to get married is during to the halakha, during the Jewish laws, okay? And he tells me, he keeps telling me that he's rescuing, he's endangering his life every day in very in sorties all over the Middle East. But if he wants to get married to his girlfriend, he have to fly to other country and get married there, and then he come back with the certification that that he got married, and in Israel then they write him as a married couple, and this is the situation in Israel, and this is the tension between religious and state. Okay. When David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of Israel in 1948, they decided of a mechanism of a status quo. You know, the status quo, what was happening in those days will maintain to the until they find another solution. And unfortunately, this status quo made a lot of troubles in Israel in two ways. The first problem is that the Jewish identity of Israel is getting erosion all the time. Okay, because for example, when the State of Israel established, there weren't any entertainment place open in Shabbat, in Saturdays. And there wasn't any shops or so open in Saturdays, and no civil transportation on Saturdays. And all this during the years get erosion from, all the time. And the worst thing is that the fighting between the sectors in Israel on these issues created terrible rifts in the Israeli citizens. And instead of the religious, the Judaism, being the thing that unifies us and being the source of pride for all of the Jewish people in Israel, it became the thing that we are fighting about it. During the years, we had some opportunities to find wide agreements that could get the situation better. These agreements, of course, would have demanded some concessions from all the sides. But unfortunately, extremists from both sides of the political map didn't accept these agreements, and therefore we're still fighting on these issues of state and religious. When I announced as a Minister of Religious Affairs, I asked for this position. Okay, when I realized that that there is a possibility that I will be appointed to be a minister, I went to my good friend, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and I asked him to be the Minister of Religious Affairs. and why I did so. Everyone thought that I'm crazy, that I asked for this position. They assume that as a fighter pilot, I will ask to be something else that depends on security or so. But I asked especially to be the Minister of Religious Affairs. And that is because I come from a very unique sector in Israel. I am from the religious Zionism. Okay, in one hand, I am an observant Jew who try to do all the God mitzvot, all the God laws, okay? On the other hand, I served in the army in the most secular units in the Israeli army for almost 30 years. So I'm familiar very good with the both worlds. And I thought, and I still think, that a guy that come from a sector like I come from, maybe can be the bridge between the religious sector and the secular sector, and maybe a guy like me can find the way to for wide agreements over these issues. Therefore, I touch a lot of sensitive issues that none of the former ministers dare to touch. I'm trying to solve problems that none of them deal with, like a lot of problems with kosher food. You know what's kosher food, okay? And issues about conversion to Judaism. Also matters of involvement of women in religious businesses, okay? When I sat on my chair, I realized that there isn't any women in religious services in a management position. And I'm changing all this. Of course, I'm not a rabbi, and I'm not touching the strict halacha, the Jewish laws. It's none of my business. I never touch it. I'm dealing with the structure of how the state of Israel deliver religious services, and I hope that if I will be good enough, a lot of secular Jewish will that now hate the establishment of the religious services will see that we have a lot to offer, and how the religious is great, and maybe they will get closer to the Judaism. That's my hope. Yeah, that was a brief from 40,000 feet. Okay, and if you want to ask questions, I don't want to get into bits and bytes. I don't want to if it's not interesting. So if you have something to ask, now it's a good time to.
Is the microphone on here? Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Minister. We're going to open it up to questions. I know a lot of you have questions about what's happening in Israel, what's happening internationally. Also, there's been a lot of questions in the last day about Iran and the conflict like that. One of the great benefits of having Minister Matan Kahane is that he answers all the questions, even the tough ones. So this is a
was
great.
in the past when I was new in the job. You understand?
So yes, we'll start with the chairman of the British Israel Allies Caucus, Mark Pritchard. Maybe we can have someone come and hand out and then we'll go to case.
Minister, thank you for spending time with us this morning. Thank you for your service in the Air Force. And thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, before I came here, I asked 2 or 3 people about your good self, as you would expect, and everything I heard was very complimentary. And I want to say thank you for tackling some very sensitive issues here in Israel in such a diplomatic and thoughtful way. And I agree that Israel's future is both with those with faith and without faith, because that's the narrative of all of our nations over generations. Hopefully more people coming to faith, but that's a matter between them and God. If I may, given that you're a minister of the government, a cabinet minister, I just wanted to ask whether you could give a little bit more insight, as much as you can say publicly, about what your government's doing to help those Jewish people who are currently in Ukraine, those Holocaust survivors, the 200,000 or so Jews, and what practical steps you are doing on that. And then secondly, slightly more sensitive, and you might want to avoid it or be that superb diplomat that you are, what more do you think Israel can do in regard to sanctions? I'm aware of what's happening in the region and your sensitivities are around the Russia issue, if I can put it like that. But also, with the history of Israel, you'll be aware of what we're seeing in Ukraine is not anything any member of the human race would want to see. Thank you.
Well, you asked very tough questions, and I will try to answer it. First of all, Israel is doing a lot to receive here and get as many as refugees that we can get from Ukraine. Okay, we know exactly, we understand the situation there, but you all have to understand that we are in a unique situation here because you actually know that Russian troops are in our borders, and we are in a delicate situation here. In spite of this fact, we said very loud that we support the Ukrainian people during what they are going through in this period, and we are sending a lot of aid to the Ukrainian people, like field hospitals and so, and of course letting a lot of refugees getting to Israel. Among them, a lot of them are descendants of Israel, and they come here under the law of return. Do you know the law of return in Israel? Because we consider Israel, of course, the land of all Jews all around the world. And the law of return says that anyone who the Nazis sent to death because of the relationship with Israel can see Israel as his secure home. And therefore, everyone who is a son or a grandson of a Jewish man or woman can come to Israel and be a citizen and get immediately a citizenship in the state of Israel. Many of the refugees who come to Israel are in this kind of people, descendant of Israel, and but we also opening our doors to any refugee who want to come to Israel and have any connection here in any contact or connection here in Israel. So from the beginning of the war, at least I think that yesterday I heard the numbers 13,000 refugees came to Israel. For example, you know how many refugees came to Britain?
So far, I think around 10,000.
Something like 3,000. Okay, so more than 4 times than Britain. So we are opening our doors to those refugees, even if they have any kind of contact to Israel, and even if not, we are welcoming there, and we are trying to do the best to receive them as best we can. But we have, first of all, to take care of our interests, and we cannot get here 40 million Ukrainian, okay? I believe that any one of you will understand this. So this is the situation that we are here in Israel, and most of all, you have to, I think that you know that our unique situation create, let our prime minister to be some kind of bridge between the leaders of those countries, between Putin and Zelensky. And you know that he's playing a very important role in this trying to give peace to the region. So I hope that it will continue, and the efforts of the Prime Minister will success.
Thank you very much, Minister, for coming to us and for your good work. I will go further on the issue of the Jews also in Ukraine. I visited 2 months ago, only 2 months ago, with the chief rabbi at the Holocaust remembering in Kiev. And so we heard there also in all troubles, always the Jewish community has the problems. And the chief rabbi and the others there were afraid that in case of war, the Jewish community should be also on the front of having troubles and problems. So it's very good to hear from you what in Israel is doing in making possible to return to Israel for the Jewish, but not all people, as you know, are able to do that. So what can we do as government in our governments to support also to have specific eye for the Jewish community in Ukraine?
Okay, I want to say 3 things, if I remember what to say. First of all, I heard Natan Sharansky. You know who is Natan Sharansky? He was the head of the Jewish agency, and he was a prisoner. Okay, you're having him tonight, so I don't want to ruin him. But I heard that he said that he was a prisoner in Russia 40 years ago or so, yes. And he said that in those days, being a Jew was the worst thing that could happen to a man. And the thing that all the Jews wanted to erase the word Jew from their certificates. And nowadays, only 40 years after being a Jew is some kind of insurance that you have a place to go in the world in case of problem. And a lot of people are trying to get Jews to escape from places that there is war because they know that here they will get a secure place to be. What you can do, you can be for Israel in your government. You know, nowadays, again, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism is raising its ugly heads. And again, we hear voices that blame Jews in all the situation, even in the climate problems. And I think that saying loud and clear that you are for Israel, the state of Israel, that you are for the Jewish people, for the Jewish country, it's very, very important for us, and it can help us a lot. And I see your name is Kes. I want to tell you a little story because I'm standing here because of a Dutch pastor who saved my grandfather during the Holocaust. And Christian pastor Kes Mulan, was rescuing my grandfather, and he was removing him from shelter to shelter all over Netherlands during the Holocaust. And afterwards he got recognized as righteous among the nation in Yad Vashem. And thanks to him, I'm standing here today. So thank you.
Last question
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you for your service. Thank you for coming. I am from Sweden, which is pretty close to Ukraine. We have, it's like 2 hours and 10 minutes flight with a commercial flight.
And your flag in the same colors.
Yeah, same colors. From Stockholm to Kiev, and with the kind of aircraft you use, it might be even shorter time, I assume. So it's pretty close, and we are, of course, following the events very closely, with bearing on our own security in our country. And there are reports when it comes to the events on the battlefield, which is going in wrong direction for the Russian army. And I was wondering what assessment you are doing from the Israeli government when it comes to the Russian military advance and the way they are having this war playing out. And with your combat experience, it would also be interesting to hear your assessment, what we are seeing right now. And do you think it's true that it's not going very well for the Russians? Thank you.
Well, it's also a very sensitive question, and I must tell you that I assume, maybe I know, that we are trying to look very closely about what happening there. I don't think that we have all the information now because the both sides are still in the fights, and they are not releasing all the information that we can learn from. As a fighter pilot, of course, I have to myself a lot of questions and wondering about what's happening there. The information that I get now is from in Twitter and Facebook, so I don't think we can rely on this now. But I'm sure that in Israel we will learn a lot from what happening there now. And actually, I was talking for 2 minutes and didn't say anything, and it was in purpose. Well, for me, I was very happy being here with you today. I know that you are a true friends of the State of Israel and our allies, and I know that we can count on you. And the most important thing is that we are sharing the same values. And our friendship is based on these Judeo-Christian values. And therefore, I'm sure that this friendship will continue. And again, I apologize for being late, and I'm very happy about the opportunity to be here with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. It's great to have you with us. We appreciate all your time. Maybe take a picture with the letter. Well, thank you so much. We know how busy you are and how busy the government is, and we appreciate your time. Well, without further ado, we're very excited to have, as we mentioned, Congressman Doug Lamborn with us, and he was so gracious to yield the floor, as they say in congressional terms. Please, if you can come, and he's going to talk about some of the things that we can do all over the world through the work that he's done in the Congress.
Thank you. What an honor to be here with all of you. You are leaders in your various countries, and so it's an honor for me to stand with you all as co-chairman of the Israel Allies caucuses in our different countries. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the U.S. I'm going to talk about some things you can do. But first of all, I just want to say why it's so important what we're doing. I really believe that we need to support Israel. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. It's unfairly discriminated against in many ways. But there's also a deeper spiritual reason, if you're a believer in Scripture, as I am, and I believe all or most of you are as well. And that goes back to Genesis 12:2, where God told Abraham that whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And he was obviously not talking about just a blessing during the life of Abraham. This was for future generations. In other words, that applies today. That is a promise that is true today. And it's a promise for individuals, and it's a promise for countries. And we here are policymakers, influencers in our different countries. So what we do when we go back to our capitals, and whether we're helping our countries be a supporter of Israel or an opponent of Israel, will make a difference in the future of our countries. I'm very proud of the fact that the United States was the first country to recognize Israel 11 minutes after it became a country in 1948. So the U.S. has done many things wrong over the years, but that's one thing it really did right, and I think God blesses countries when they support Israel. So in the U.S., there's three things that we do as congressmen or parliamentarians, as legislators. We offer laws and amendments. We try to influence our regulators and bureaucrats, like the State Department. Sometimes they have a mind of their own, and Congress has to tell them what to do, but they may or may not always listen. And funding priorities. We do set the budget, and we can influence what's done in a lot of funding issues, whether they get the money or not. Now, I'll just make a brief aside. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, so I have a unique opportunity here in this room. The U.S. has a huge military budget, and we have a strong relationship with Israel. So I get to work on things with our security relationship. I was there when we first started funding Iron Dome. I offered the amendment to double the funding, and that's what helped Israel have the protection that it has now with Iron Dome. People will come up to me who have relatives in Israel and say, you saved the life of my son. You saved the life of my daughter. And that's very touching and fulfilling to be a part of that, helping Israel with its Iron Dome project. But also there's David Sling, there's Arrow 2, Arrow 3. And in the future, using lasers and directed energy, there's Iron Beam, where you use lasers to shoot down, for instance, drones, and eventually mortars and artillery and rockets and missiles. So that's something I get to work on that's real special. But what are things that we've done in Congress that also could be done in your country? It was mentioned the Taylor Force Act, where I was, with the help of the foundation, I was able to get this into law in the U.S., and it goes back to the story of Taylor Force. Do some of you know the story of who Taylor Force was? He was a veteran, a U.S. veteran, was served in Afghanistan. He went back to school after serving in the military. He was going to Vanderbilt. He was over here in Israel doing some studying abroad and visiting Israel, and he was killed in a terrorist attack, just a random terrorist attack. The person who I believe knifed him to death was also killed by security forces a few minutes later. And Taylor Force was not Jewish, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so in his memory, we brought legislation to say that the U.S. would no longer send money to the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority turns around and gives money to terrorists who are in prison or if they die, their surviving family. And sometimes they even give you a bigger payment if you've killed more Jews. And that is just wrong. That is wrong. And U.S. taxpayer dollars or any country's taxpayer dollars, the European Union, you know, money goes to the Palestinian Authority and they turn around and do things like that. And that shouldn't happen. So the Taylor Force Act, passed under Donald Trump, said we would no longer keep doing that. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has been walking back on that, and there's some problems there with implementation of that today that I'm very concerned about. And I'm going to talk to Juan Vargas, who couldn't be with us. He tried to be with us. He's a colleague of mine from California, a Democrat. I'm a Republican. We work bipartisanly in a lot of ways. And we're going to work on an extension of the Taylor Force Act to financial institutions that also deal with the Palestinian Authority. But also, laws pertaining to BDS. You know what BDS is. That's been talked about this morning. But we want to apply, and we haven't been successful, so sometimes these ideas work, sometimes they don't. But we can fight BDS by higher learning institutions, colleges and universities, because in the U.S. they get taxed to listen to us when we add conditions to that money. And one is to not participate in any BDS seminars, movements, etc. Also, private companies that do business with the U.S., we want to penalize them if they participate in BDS. Now, we have the First Amendment in the United States. We can't tell people you can't be prejudiced, you can't do discriminatory things in your private life, but when it affects government funding, we can tell you to stop. And that's what we're doing and trying to do with some of this legislation I just mentioned. Also, there are laws that discriminate against Israel for activities in the Western Bank or Judea and Samaria. You know, you've heard of Zillow or Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and there's other companies as well. They say if Israeli companies do business in the West Bank, we're not going to do business with that company. And that's kind of supporting BDS. That's supporting discrimination, I believe, against Israeli companies because of where they're located. So, but there's many other things we can do in our countries. We can have joint programs with Israel on trade issues, education, sports, culture, healthcare, science and technology, commerce, telecom, all kinds of things like that. Israel has so much to offer when it comes to these different areas. And our countries, as a country or companies within our country, can really benefit from having strong relations with Israel. I think there are some amazing, you know, you've read the book maybe, I hope you all have. If not, I'll recommend it to you, Startup Nation. Israel has amazing creativity and innovation, and by partnering with them, our corporations and businesses and countries will benefit. Some of the things that we used to work on, it was mentioned earlier, we who were like-minded in the U.S. and wanted to support Israel, for years we were introducing resolutions saying the U.S. needs to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Or we would have resolutions recognizing Israeli sovereignty or control anyway over the Golan Heights, or the legality of settlements in contested areas, the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, or defunding the Palestinian Authority, or supporting Israel in the United Nations when bad resolutions were being brought against Israel. And then the Trump administration came in and did all these things. So we had been offering resolutions for years, and then they come in and just did everything, and we looked at each other and said, what else is there to do? It's all been done. And so there were some good things. With Mr. Trump, he's said and done things that I don't agree with, but when it comes to policy, he did some amazing things that really shook up our country, sometimes shook up the world, shook up the United Nations, but there were some things that needed to be shaken up. And when it comes to the treatment of Israel, he and Ambassador Friedman and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and others, I think, did a wonderful job of making that relationship stronger between the U.S. and Israel than it's ever been in our history. So I'm really concerned now, though, with the potential Iran nuclear deal. That was done in a very bad way under Barack Obama. It was not submitted to the U.S. Senate as a treaty. If you remember, it was done almost as an executive order, and he asked the Senate to ratify it with a majority vote, because it would have not gotten 2/3 supermajority, which you need for a treaty. So it was done under a flawed process, which meant that Donald Trump could come in and undo it by executive order. And that's exactly what happened. And then with Mike Pompeo, they had the maximum sanctions policy to pressure Iran into doing the right thing. In other words, giving up a weaponized nuclear program with the missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, to deliver those warheads. And I think they were delaying, and we were actually making progress. Now the jury is out on the Biden administration and whether they're going to actually carry through or go back to the Barack Obama, I think, soft and flawed approach that would let Iran become a nuclear power with weapons that would threaten Israel. And they've said, we want to wipe Israel off the map, and you need to take people seriously. Vladimir Putin, he said things about Ukraine. A lot of us said, oh, he's not going to really do that. Could he do that? And then he turns around and does it. So you have to take people at their word. So that's kind of the next thing on the agenda with at least the U.S., and it's going to involve all of our countries sooner or later, one way or another, whether or not Iran has a free rein to develop nuclear weapons. And I'm so concerned about that. And we in Congress, we try to influence the administration. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. They have a mind of their own, as you all know. And we want to work together. And I know it was said earlier, foreign affairs is the first responsibility of the executive branch. However, our legislative branches have a huge role in that as well, funding and everything else. So we want to be involved as much as we can. So, Josh, that's going to be the next thing that's that's coming down the turnpike that I'm concerned about for Israel and for all of the rest of the world. Because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, they are going to have a threat of using those, and maybe actually will use those. And that would be devastating for our future. So those are some of the things that are happening, some things that we're involved in the U.S. Congress. But I want to encourage all of you, we all have a role that we can play as leaders, as influencers in our own countries. And let's take full advantage of that. Thank you so much. Another thing we can do, apart from the laws that we pass or the budgets that we pass, is we can speak out. We're influencers. We can speak out in our media, and they'll listen to us. People will listen to us. So what we need to do, Josh, in the U.S. is to make it so clear that the public is not behind this, that the administration will have to listen and do the right thing. There's elections coming up in November in the U.S., and that has the attention of the administration. They don't want to lose the House and or the Senate, because that would really slow Joe Biden's ability to carry out his policies in the future. So we do have their attention when we say, hey, this is going to hurt you in the elections. If you're weak on Iran and let them have nuclear weapons, you're going to pay a price in November. So we can get their attention, and that's what we've got to do. But I'm really concerned because look how Putin had a veiled threat of using nuclear weapons. He said, if you help Ukraine, things will happen to you that have never happened before. Well, what does that mean? Okay, yeah, that means nuclear weapons. And then he put his nuclear forces on high alert. So he was threatening nuclear action against other countries. And they do have a policy of using tactical nuclear weapons in certain circumstances, at least on the books. Let's hope they don't ever, God forbid that they ever use them. So, and another thing that many people don't think about, Josh, but if Iran gets nuclear weapons, other countries around there are going to want their own nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia, what are they going to do? They and Iran hate each other. They hate each other. Are they going to stand by and say, oh, they have nuclear weapons, but we won't do anything? They've got money. They can buy them overnight from Pakistan. They could send $1 billion to Pakistan and say, send us some nuclear weapons. So other countries in the region, Turkey, other countries will have nuclear weapons if Iran has nuclear weapons. And this isn't, as we know from history, is not the most stable part of the world. So we don't want that to happen for a lot of reasons. So that's our concern, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Lamborn, and thank you for doing so much for the state of Israel. We really appreciate everything. I know that there's not an Israeli who doesn't appreciate the Taylor Force Act and the Iron Dome system and what you're doing to fight BDS, and it's really just tremendous and it shows how one person can make such a big difference. And I know there's a lot of members of the caucus who stand behind you, but whenever we hear something positive coming out of Congress, I always see the name Congressman Doug Lamborn attached to it, so we really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you. We're going to take a 15-minute break where everyone's going to have coffee or go to the restroom, and then we're going to continue with our program. So please be prompt. We have 15 minutes, and then we're going to get back to work. General in Reserve, Seema Vaknim. Oh, we got the mic. Yeah, very good. So I can skip apologizing about the microphone, but I'd like to call up Seema Vaknim to give a very important briefing about combat anti-Semitism and what can be done to implement IRA within your own countries. Please, Seema.
Actually, after hearing Doug, I think I would change a little bit my, my presentation. I was thinking a lot, what is it that I can say that you probably haven't heard so far or are not familiar with? So I will try to do something a little bit different with you.
Can you please shut the door there?
Yeah. So I will try to do something which is what we in the Air Force we call a super strategy overview. By the way, Matan and I served together in the Israeli Air Force. We were always joking that they were the pilots, but actually all they did was deliver payloads. So we did all the job as intelligence person, telling them where to go, who to eat, how much bombs to take, what warheads, and so on and so forth. But thank God for people like Matan, who has the guts to do what they do. So I will tell you a little bit about myself, then about combat anti-Semitism movement, and then I would like to take you on a kind of a journey, but from a super strategy point of view, or what we call in the Air Force 40,000 feet overview of a situation, mainly trying to answer the questions, how come it is so difficult to fight anti-Semitism? What is it that we are fighting, which is so hard to counter, change, and definitely those who wish that anti-Semitism will not be in a few years, I think they are very optimistic, but let's do the journey together and see where we are. So let me start by saying that I never thought that in the years after my service in the Israeli Air Force and the IDF, I would be standing in this kind of target audience talking to you about anti-Semitism. Actually, I had another thing in mind. I was starting to write a book combining two hobbies of mine, one the intelligence, the other one is the singularity age. And I started writing a book about intelligence work in the singularity age using mind controls and things like that, and that was very interesting for me. But I have to tell you that my journey through different positions in my life took me to this state of mind now that I decided to dedicate my last year as an active person to fighting anti-Semitism, because I believe this is not just a risk for the Jewish people, but actually, as I told someone before, it is actually a risk to democracies as a whole. And if you would see the forces that are pushing anti-Semitism, you would also see them pushing revolution against democratic values, against democratic states, against democratic establishment. So all in all, this is fight not just for Israel, not just for Jewish people, but actually for peoplehood, for mankind, for humanity, for liberal values, which I personally very much appreciate. And this is something that I appreciate so much, you being here, you doing what you do, being who you are, being here for Israel. I know that taking this stand today in the environment and the public discourse is not easy. I do understand that. I'm having a lot of conversation with young people coming from Ivy League universities in the States, and I can see the brainwashing they are going through, and it's so hard to explain to them that what they see is not the reality. So thank you for what you're doing. And I would start just telling you how come I find myself doing what I'm doing today. I started my journey as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, in the Israeli Air Force, which is kind of a different unit inside the Israeli Defense Forces. I was an expert on research, expert on cybersecurity, and an expert on targeting, intel for operation. This was my main thing. When it comes to content, I'm a specialist on SRBMs, short-range ballistic missiles, and long-range ballistic missiles, and the Syrian and the Iranian arena. Those were the main topics which I dealt with. And over there, during my 20 years in the Israeli Air Force, I usually was the one who was approached to do what we called in the Defense Forces the super strategy. Before you come in to deal with any kind of phenomena, before you are coming to deal with any kind of challenge, you have to understand the bigger picture. And this is the role of the intelligence person, to understand the bigger picture in order to eventually come up with the right tactics. And I have to say that I've heard you before. You came up with the right tactics in many cases. I would like to weave it into a bigger picture of what is it that we are fighting. My last 10 years in the IDF was with the role of the censorship of Israel. I have to tell, especially those of you who come from Western countries, and the word censor means a little bit annoying to your Western ear, that in Israel it is a different thing than what you would have expected in other countries. First of all, Israel is the only country who have a censor, a democratic country who have a censor with a uniform, with a military uniform doing this job. But because of that, and because the censorship comes from the British mandate, what actually came to be in Israel is that this is the person who knows all the secrets of Israel, but actually protects security of Israel by mediating between two values, the freedom of expression and the security of the state. And this is what this role, unique role, enabled me to understand that we are not just facing enemies on the borders of Israel, not just Syria, not just Iran, not just ISIS on the south border, but actually there was something else lurking in the shadows, and this is what we call today the Delegitimization Campaign. With your permission, I will not use the BDS. BDS is just one manifestation of a greater phenomena, which is the real threat to Israel and the Jewish people, and actually, I think, even greater than that. And this is the Delegitimization Campaign to a whole country, meaning that we don't have the right to exist. And if you had any questions regarding this, just listen to what Amnesty says, listen to what Kenneth Ross in HRW says, and you would know that they've taken the mask off, and now they're saying it up front. They don't need the masks anymore. So when I was the chief censor of Israel, and the Marmara ordeal happened, and I can tell you in this close circle that I was there when we did the plans, and now I know how many risks IDF took in order to make sure that there will be no casualties, and I know exactly how all the narratives were against us after things happened. And that was amazing to me. How come Israel, such a sophisticated country, couldn't put its narrative on? How come I'm meeting with external reporters who are stationed in Israel, and they're telling me, listen, I know you are right. I know the story that you are telling, the IDF spokesperson is telling is the right one. But my editor does not allow me to put it in the paper because it doesn't feel well. It doesn't correlate with public discourse, and so on and so forth. So this was the first time I understood that our enemies are not just in the borders, and it's not just a physical enemy, it's more than that. So since 2010, I've started diving a little bit into what now is known as the Delegitimization Campaign against Israel. Many people call it BDS, but I really urge you guys who deal with this issue, don't use the BDS, because BDS is small. By the way, I have to tell you, if it was just about BDS, let them do that. We don't pay the price. Not economically, not culturally, not in sport, not in legal issues. But when it comes to eroding our self-determination here in Israel, this is what matters. When I left the military, at the rank of a brigadier general in 2015, I was called by Gilad Erdan, then the Minister of Strategic Affairs, now the Israeli UN ambassador, and he asked me, together with the Prime Minister, Bibi, who you will meet today, to actually take my military capabilities, not capabilities when it comes to tools or tactics, but actually the thinking process of how to fight an enemy or how to fight a challenge, take these capabilities and come up with something unique for the Delegitimization Campaign. So for 4 years, I ran the Ministry of Strategic Affairs as Director General under Gilad Erdan and Prime Minister Bibi, and I actually created a task force. This task force, after 6 months of formulating a full strategy, this task force fought the war. In this case, it was a war, and I'm using this word very cautiously, but I choose it. I choose to use it. We fought the war against those who are trying to kill us, Kill us, I mean kill the essence of the Jewish state, not personally. I've done this for 4 years, and I have to tell you that again, I thought I was fighting delegitimization, which was the main danger. But then I was exposed, and this is something I'm telling you, and I'm quite ashamed of it, I have to tell you. Being an Israeli, you're not exposed to anti-Semitism. You don't really know what's going on outside. I remember meeting with American Jewish leadership, and they were telling me, you're blind. You don't understand what we are facing. You don't know the dangers that's going to be in the United States in a few years. And I really thought, I have to tell you, at the first year of my, as a Director General, I even remember a conversation with Josh about it, I thought they were exaggerating. But then I came to understand that delegitimization, as BDS is just one manifestation of delegitimization, which is just one manifestation of the left-wing anti-Semitism, we have a whole array of anti-Semitism things to fight for. And this is why I chose to do what I'm doing today. I also chose to do one more thing. I happen to believe that there are main routes to fight anti-Semitism, so I chose to fight anti-Semitism on those routes. So I work with ISGAP, who's an academic center based in Cambridge and Oxford, fighting anti-Semitism from within with faculty against faculty. I'm with the ICC, who fights on campus. I have a client who is the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, right now fighting for their own lives, but this is fighting against Holocaust distortion and Holocaust denial. I've been working with a group called the NCRI, Network Contagion Research Institute, based in Rutgers, and over there we're dealing with the cyber issues. We're actually decrypting the net and understanding how contagion patterns of extremism are happening on the net. And the main thing, in its name I'm standing here before you today, the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. We believe in the Combat Anti-Semitism movement that in order to fight anti-Semitism, it can't be done separately by different organizations. It has to be done by a movement, and this is why it's Combat Anti-Semitism movement. We are part of a bigger thing called Combat Hate Foundation. We have several entities in this foundation. One of them I will not talk about, I will just say what it is. It's the Muhayraq Project. The Muhayraq Project is actually trying to create coalition between Muslims and Jews, fighting hate together. Combat Hate Foundation, fighting hate together. The Muhayraq Project is run parallel to Combat Anti-Semitism. Who are we? We are a group, a coalition of 480 organizations worldwide. We are global, we are grassroots, we are non-partisan. We deal with a political issue because anti-Semitism is a political issue, but we are non-partisan. We are dealing it from the left, from the right, from Islam. We work with Muslim, Christian, and Jews. We are interfaith. We are multicultural. We work with organizations that do a great job, and we consider ourselves to be a platform to empower those organizations. We don't want to do what they are doing. We want to enhance their work, their good work. We want to create synergy because we believe that synergy between a whole lot of groups working together for the same cause is the thing that will do and make the change. And this is what we do in Combat Anti-Semitism. Our DNA, by the way, is IRA. Our pledge is based on IRA. Everyone who joins the coalition, and as I told you, we have 480 organizations, but we also have 360,000 people around the world who signed the pledge and are ready at our call to do something. We haven't used this until now, mainly because of Corona. Everything we are doing is online. But when we start going into in-person activities, those 360,000 people around the world, this is the real force. So we based our whole notion on IRA. And we work on 3 different parallel pillars, tracks. One is diplomatic route. Together with me works Robert Zinger, who used to be the CEO of the World Jewish Congress. This is, I have to tell you, a one-man show, a one-man MFA. So he knows everybody all over the world, and the diplomatic routes that he leads is making waves and getting impact in many different cases. And we also work grassroots, meaning that we work with people around the world, and we are trying to build a coalition of individuals fighting for the same cause. And the organizations, this is the coalition. I have Catherine here who works with me, and she's in charge of building the partnership. I have to tell you that Combat Anti-Semitism Movement is an organization. We are trying to stimulate a movement. It's not easy. I just told, again, I don't remember who I talked to, but I told someone before, when your movement is willing to do something which is radical, violent, revolutionary, fighting for something which is injustice everybody agrees on, okay? Black Lives Matter, Women's March, Me Too, things like that, it's easier to create a movement because the cause is clear and there is acceptance that the cause is just and injustice should be correct, and injustice should be corrected sometimes by violence but mainly by revolutionary acts. This is not how the Combat Anti-Semitism work. We are a positive movement. We are trying to create coalition. We are trying to do good. We fight anti-Semitism, this is our main backbone, but we also fight other hatred. And we are fighting something which is very hard to deal with. And what I would like to do now is try to talk to you a little bit about anti-Semitism and why it is so much challenge to deal with. And I would like to share with you an assumption that I have. I'm working on a paper right now dealing with it, and love to hear your thoughts about it. So I think we all can agree that anti-Semitism is on the rise right now. We see it on the network, we see it on media, we see it on campuses. By the way, not just in the United States. Go to the UK, go to France, go to Sweden, go elsewhere. Wherever you have campuses, wherever you have young students, wherever you have those progressives ideas, not liberals, liberals are fine, but progressive extreme ideas, you would find anti-Semitism, or you would find the delegitimization groups who are pushing anti-Semitism. So we see it everywhere. The second thing that we see, it is anti-Semitism has become mainstream. It's not in the fringe anymore. You can see that on CNN. You can see that in unions. You work in unions. You definitely can see it in major faculty members on Ivy Leagues, and so on and so forth. So it's become the mainstream. And what's more important is, and this is something that I've learned working with Decoding Anti-Semitism. Decoding Anti-Semitism, it's a project from Landocker Foundation dealing with the issue of anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories which people are using without even understanding that they are using anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories. So what they have found, this group who now works in, it is based in Germany, UK and France. The German part is doing the linguistic analysis. The UK part is doing the AI next phase, and the French one will translate it into French. So what the German group just found out, that 70% of normal discourse online, 70%, this is amazing, is actually based on anti-Semitic notions without the people who are using it even understand that this is what they are doing. So I'm not talking about the explicit expressions of anti-Semitism, I'm talking about hidden and implicit expressions of anti-Semitism. So it's become normal, it's become very much spread, and it's a global phenomenon. And it's a global phenomenon not just because you have the same groups working in different countries, or you have a campaign that different groups from different countries push that. It's become a global phenomenon mainly because the narrative itself is something which unites several groups. I will give you just one example to explain what I'm talking about. We asked ourselves, how come a UK-based person would take a plane, go to Texas, go into a synagogue, hijack the rabbi, and ask for another rabbi to be brought in so he could tell her to talk to the government in the US to free Sadiq Yafia, okay? How come you have this combination? So what we have seen using the analysis tools that NCRI brings to the table is that this was what we call a global effect. We have CARE Texas pushing a campaign to free Sadiq Afia, okay? Their campaign, because they are an NGO based in the US, was very moderate. They called for the release of a terrorist, which is, it's okay, it's a free country, they can do whatever they want. They used anti-Semitic tropes, but it was very, very mild, very moderate. Then suddenly, after 2 spikes in the CARE campaign, we saw suddenly a network of bots from Pakistan pushing the same narrative and the same call, but this time using anti-Semitic tropes which are very, very extreme. One of them was the Jews control the media, Jews control Hollywood, Jews control the puppet government in the US establishment. If you want to free Sadiq Afia, use the Jews. Okay? This was run by bots in Pakistan. So we have an NGO in the States, bots by Pakistani entity, I don't know if it's governmental or something else, pushing the narrative and making it more extreme. And suddenly you have a UK-based person taking a plane and going to Texas. We couldn't find causality, but we could find correlation because we can prove that this guy was exposed to the network of the bots. So this is what becomes when anti-Semitism becomes global. So it's not just campaign, not just groups. 2021 was a hard year, very hard year, by the way, the worst year ever since someone started recording anti-Semitic events. I can give you some numbers or you can take my word on that. But I can tell you something else. 2022 is already starting to be even worse. We monitor at Combat Anti-Semitism on a weekly basis the anti-Semitic incidents around the world, and we already see a 50% spike in anti-Semitic events, not just because the issue of Ukraine and Russia, which has a lot of contribution to that, but actually because the environment is less mild. So I would like to offer the 2 next statements. 1, I think that the last 2 years gave us, the Jewish people, Israel, and all of us who cares about democracies, a strategic alert. Unlike a conditional alert or status alert, which is talking about a specific something that will happen at a specific time, I'm talking about a strategic alert because I think that we have reached what we call in the Israeli Air Force the PNR, point of no return. Point of no return for pilots is the point from which you have to go forwards, you can't go backwards. So in our case, I think that we are reaching a point which will be a tipping point in reality. So how come when we invest so much in fighting anti-Semitism, how come still it is becoming so difficult to battle with or to counter? And my second assumption is that in the last 2 decades, mainly since the Durban UN Convention in 2001, but not just, it was before, I have to say, but the Durban is a kind of a tipping point when it comes to especially the Israeli issue. In the last 2 decades, there are too many junction points between super or mega trends, events, phenomena, currents, call them whatever you are. I'm going to cite just 9 of them and show you how they are combined together. Each one is based on social or political or economical either challenge or ideology or interest of groups or even states in some cases. But as a whole, those mega super trends are creating the atmosphere and creating the platform for anti-Semitism to flourish. Each one of them, by alone, can actually deliver anti-Semitism to what they perceive to be even a bigger point. Meaning each one with its own manifestation, its groups, its narratives, whatever, it doesn't really matter, can push anti-Semitism forward. But combined together, they create the Big Bang that we see today. And I really urge you to understand that this is not just another year with another set of anti-Semitic behavior. I really believe that this is kind of a Big Bang. And I really believe that we are in a, I don't want to say dangerous point, but definitely a point to be taken care of and to be aware of. And I have to tell you that talking to a lot of groups, usually I feel that people don't feel at ease to understand that this is the issue and we need to counter that. People usually want to feel that they're in a safe place, and as history proved us once and again, being optimistic is fine, but when reality knocks on your door, you better open it and understand what it is. Fighting anti-Semitism, even without this, is a very, very difficult thing to do, mainly because this is not a local phenomenon. This is not something that has a beginning or an end. This is not something that is for a specific target audience. It is global, it is multi-audience, there is many narratives, sometimes contradictory. When you answer to one on his narratives, you actually empower the narrative of the other. So as a whole, fighting anti-Semitism is very difficult, and when you put it together with those 9 mega trends, I think we are creating a platform for even bigger anti-Semitism, but for us as a group who wants to fight anti-Semitism, it's getting harder and harder. So, under the assumption that everything that I will say from now on is phenomena that you are aware of, I'm not going to explain the phenomena. I just want to emphasize how this phenomena contributes to what I've just said, okay? The 9, I don't want to rank them. Only the first 2, I think, are the most important. The others, you can put them whatever you are in the rank of the 9. And the first thing is the delegitimization campaign. And I would have to say the delegitimization campaign, and the most impactful thing that happened from that is that there is no agreement today even about what anti-Semitism is, and hence the fight on the IRA definition. Okay, so I want to talk about the delegitimization campaign. I have to say you don't have to agree with how I analyze this, but this is the way I see it after 6 years of dealing with this issue. So first of all, delegitimization campaign is not a campaign on social justice. It's not a political campaign. It's not about the Israeli government changing its policies towards Palestinians. It's not about the Israeli government leaving Judah and Samaria. By the way, if it was, you would find more Israelis supporting the BDS, but it's not, or supporting the delegitimization campaign. This is exactly the mask that they put on. What it is really all about is about the fact that they don't accept the existence of Israel as the homeland for the Jewish people. And if you want the best proof, then just go backwards and see where some of the slogans that we use today, or they use today, started. Israel is an apartheid state didn't start in 1967. The first time it was used was in 1961. That's before the occupation of Judah and Samaria. So under the guise of social justice movement, which correlates to a lot of other things that are happening in the West today, they're actually doing a very methodical tarnishing of Israel. By the way, when we do a topic analysis on the net regarding Israel, do you know what we find? Israel is a startup nation. Israel contributed a lot to the world. We have percentage Nobelists more than any other, the Jewish people and Israel, and so on and so forth. There are so many good things that could be connected to Israel. But when we do topic analysis, I don't know if you know how it looks like a map. You have Israel in the middle and the main topics connected to that. Okay, this is the discourse going on Twitter, on Reddit, on Gab, on YouTube, and so on and so forth. All of the words connected to Israel are negative. Imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, controlling the media, controlling the world, so on and so forth. Okay? So when it comes to tarnishing Israel, I have to tell you, they have succeeded. And they've been doing this very successfully because they kept the mask on. Now, when they are on solid ground, now when they have their own representative in some of the parliaments around the world, in Ireland, in South Africa, in some cases in the US, now they can take the mask off. So now you can hear O'Brien from Amnesty saying Israel doesn't have the right to exist. Who puts you to say that? With all due respect to you. Do I tell you that the US doesn't have the right to exist? How come you, although your father is Jewish, by the way, some of our greatest opponents come from within the Jewish people, which is, I don't know how come. So anyway, they have taken the mask off. And this is the real engine to anti-Semitism, what we saw as classical anti-Semitism or contemporary anti-Semitism, but it doesn't really matter. Because when you see people running in London trying to find Jews to beat them, it doesn't matter if they come from the left or they come from the right. The environment is hatred of Jews, hatred of Israel, hatred of Zionism, and the Jews out there are paying the price. I would like to tell you that I went through a personal journey. I didn't believe that at first, but after 6 years dealing with that, I now believe that the delegitimization campaign is a threat to our national security. I'm not saying this lightly. After dealing with Iran, after dealing with Syria, using the word national security, threat to national security, is not something that I do lightly. But I really believe that. You know why? Because this is exactly what soft power does. You can deal with hard power. It's easier to deal with enemies that you can articulate. This is the person who wants to kill me. I'm going to kill him first. I've done this a lot. I'm telling you, it's easy. But when you don't have a face to your enemy, when your rival is someone who truly believes he's doing right, when he doesn't buy things from Judah and Samaria, or when he thinks that Israel is an apartheid state, how do you fight that? And when we are losing the ground for being a moral country, which we are, for being a country that has the right to exist, which we are, for being a people, which we are, and a nation, which we are, we're not just a religion, Jews. When we are losing the ground for that, and this is what delegitimization campaign has created, this is where we're starting to lose our national security. And there are two main drives. As you remember in Yubit Nontan Sharansky today, he was talking about dehumanization, demonization, and delegitimization, double standard. Double standard is being pushed by international organizations, United Nations, Human Rights Council, ICC. But the other two, the delegitimization and the dehumanization, is run by NGOs all over the world. But at the ministry, we have done mapping. We've tried to see from all those hundreds of organizations who really pushes forward this. And we find three clusters, one in the US, one in Europe, one in Central America, and all three clusters, all the engines were Palestinian organizations except the one in the UK, which was not a Palestinian entity. So those organizations are pushing the other narrative, which is very easy to digest because their story is very simple. We are the weak, we are the indigenous, they are the foreigners, they are the privileged, they are the whites, they don't have any rights here, so they came here, they pushed us aside. Israel was given to them because of the Holocaust, one of the stupidest allegations that I've heard, and we pay the price, we Palestinians pay the price. So whenever, see what happens to us between Russia and Ukraine today. I guess all of us, without fully understanding what was the cause of Putin to do what he does, and I have to tell you up front, I'm with you on that, we probably all feel more for the Ukrainians than for any Russian, even if they pay the price. Because there's good and there's evil, and in this case, Russia is evil. There's good and there's evil, and they put Israel on the side of the evil. So when it is a fight between evil and good, you always go with the good. So actually what the delegitimization campaign, it took a political, military fight between two nationalities, and they transformed it into a fight over values. And as, by the way, Zelensky told the Parliament of Israel yesterday, you can mediate between countries, but you cannot mediate between values. You cannot mediate between evil and good, and therefore, Israelis, Jews are always on the wrong side of the equation. So this is what the delegitimization campaign did, but what he also managed to do was that he eroded the acceptance of IRA as the definition of anti-Semitism. 34 countries are mistaken. People who said years after years trying to come up with the right declaration of what is anti-Semitism are wrong. But because of the fight of over the 11 examples at IRA, which 7 of them are connected to Israeli issues, there was a fight about anti-Semitism, because all those who believe the Delegitimization Campaign believes that the IRA definition is just here to shut up criticism of Israel, which is a stupid thing to say. By the way, knowing Israelis are the one who are more criticizing their government than any other person I know. I was in the government and I was criticizing Bibi all the time. It doesn't really matter. There's a criticism and there's a not accepting the fact that we can live. So when it comes to IRA, suddenly IRA is being questioned because of that. And the second thing, new other declarations are coming up. Look at the JDA, Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. What is it? You have 5 topics which are on the face of it. What kind of term is it? On the face of it, anti-Semitic. And then they put another 5 terms which are definitely not anti-Semitic. But when you look at the other 5, who the JDA put on the table, all of them are from the house of the Delegitimization Campaign, okay? So all in all, this is the first phenomena, and if I would use metaphor, I like to use metaphor in order to explain the world. This is like the software that is being inserted into different types of hardware. And the hardware is the next thing. The next phenomena, which is big, only on those 2 I would elaborate so much, on the other I will go very quickly. 5 more minutes, okay. The combination, or the correlation, or the coordination, or the alliance, call it whatever you want, between the Delegitimization Campaign and the social extreme movement, progressive movements from the left, especially in the United States, but I have to tell you, not just. We also saw it in different places. So you have, and I'm guessing you know all these terms, I'm just going to throw them. So we have the alliance of the oppressed, the intersectionality. We have the walk, the awakening of the white people to what they've done to those who are not whites. We have the CRT, critical race theory. We have CSJ's, social justice theory, and so on and so forth. A lot of phenomena who are coming not from the liberal camp, but actually from the extreme progressive camp inside the left. I have to tell you one thing. Today, we are seeing signs that from inside the liberal camps, people are saying, this is not me. This is not what I believe in. But going back, the combination between Delegitimization Campaign and those movements and those things actually creates a big bang between them and colors everything that is local to the US or local to the UK or whatever in the flag signs of Palestinians. So suddenly the Jews are white and privileged, and they are not even have the right to deal with racism because they can't understand the topic. And what's more important is, because this is some kind, you know, talking to these people, and I've done it twice, and I decided not to do it anymore because I thought it was a waste of my time, really. You feel that you are talking to a religious fanatic, to some kind of faith zealous, I don't know, some kind of a crusade that they are using. So in this case, there is no in-between. You can't be either or. You can't be in both places. You need to be either or. You need to choose. So you can't be a Zionist and an LGBTQ. You simply can't. See what happened to Blake Flayton. You can't be a Zionist and be for, I don't know, environmental issues. This is pinkwashing, greenwashing, whitewashing, everything is washing in this case. So you can't even have a talk with those people. Now take that and put on top of that the campaign against us, and suddenly Israel and Jews are on the wrong side of the equation, because between black and white, we are black. There is no gray. There's just black. Because of time, I would go very quickly. The third phenomena is what we call closing of the horseshoe. We know the Red-Green Alliance, okay? I guess everyone here knows what it is about. It's radical Islam and political Islam combined with the left wing. And on that, you have the issue of Palestinians. But what we see today, and it's very interesting, is that we have a combination between right groups and left groups and Islamic groups when the lowest common denominator is anti-Semitism. And some of the combinations are amazing, because how come you see someone who comes from the right who hates minorities, But when it comes to Jews, he's willing to cooperate with Black Lives Matter. Or he's willing to cooperate with Muslims. Suddenly it's okay. If you have the main thing that you hate, then it's okay to have. So we see the same tropes and the same narratives, which are amazing because you have one interpretation on the right and another interpretation on Islam, for example, but it's the same thing. So if on the right you have Jews as subhuman or superhuman, in Islam you have a subhuman in radical Islam because this is what we are pigs in the Quran, and a superhuman in the political Islam because we control the world. And it's right at the same thing. And in the UK, CST saw that there was huge combination between different groups when it comes to anti-Semitism. But it creates a cacophony of hate, and that's the issue. And there is no logic. When you want to fight something, you need logic. If we don't have logic, we can't fight it. From here, just headlines. The next phenomena is the rise of the social networks. I would just like to say about that, it creates a bubble. The business model is pushing extremism, and what actually it does, it's like a plague. And this is exactly what we do in the NCRI. We show the contagion patterns of extremism and anti-Semitism on the net. And you really can see, just like the virus spreads, you can see how anti-Semitism and extremism spread, sometimes to people who 2 months ago were not practicing anti-Semitism. You really could see how some of the users are becoming extreme and more extreme and more extreme because they are inside a hub which echoes everything they believe in. Fifth phenomena is external crises who brings out anti-Semitism because it's inherent. Every crisis brings on anti-Semitism. So we had the economic crisis in 2008. We had the coronavirus with all its tropes from the Middle Ages. And now we have the Ukrainian Russian War. And if you think that anti-Semitism is not being practiced on this, you are wrong. Because we saw 50% spike, as I told you before. And for that, for example, on the right, whites are fighting whites, Ukrainians and Russians, and the Jews are getting the benefit. Okay, this is their narrative. For others, Zelensky is a Jewish. For others, the oligarchs surrounding Putin are the Jewish. So it's between Jewish people and we whites pay the price, and so on and so forth. And of course, Israel benefits and so on. So whenever there's a crisis, anti-Semitism rise. But what happens in those decades, 2 decades, is that we have a crisis every 6 to 8 years. So it happens that the wave from the last crisis has not gone down and it's up again. So it's an uphill all the time. The sixth one is that we are going further and further from the Holocaust. I don't think I have to elaborate on that. The seventh one, the immigration to Europe. I don't want to say anything about the immigration except for 2 things. They bring the intolerance of the Middle East to European soil, and they bring the hatred of the Middle East to European soil. And the governments in Europe do not know how to deal with it. So they let them be, and eventually, by the way, we will not pay the price. European citizens will pay the price. But from an anti-Semitic point of view of how to fight it, I'm just saying that this is what happens. There is a general phenomena, sociologists, I'm finishing already, are talking about it a lot, and this is the shallowness of public discourse. People don't really know what they're talking about, don't really understand. They're using headlines, they're using memes, they're using photos. Our youngest generation, I really don't understand what they are doing. I met a group last week, and 7 young kids raised their hand when I asked who didn't read 1 book in his life. 7 kids out of 20 raised their hands. So I really don't know, but take that shallow discourse and combine it with the extremism on politics in Europe, in US, elsewhere. You have extreme right and extreme left. That always promotes anti-Semitism. And the last one, again, this is something which I'm not an expert on, but I read a lot about it, and this is the weakness of democratic establishment around the world today. Fukuyama is going from one show to another explaining why he was not wrong in his book, The End of History. But this is what we are experiencing. Democratic states are weakening, the establishment, the public, doesn't want to relate to them, doesn't hear them. That's why, for example, all the corona regulation are being fought so hard. But also, Jewish establishment are losing their grounds. They are not, the youngs don't care about Jeffna, don't care about WJC, don't care about AJC. So the old establishment that created some kind of stability in reality, they're actually losing. So take all that and see how you can fight it. We are still trying to do that, but you have to understand the bigger picture before coming up with the right tools, and this is what Combat Anti-Semitism is trying to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Seema. That's a lot of information, and it's very depressing. We're going to distribute some of this information to you so you have it. We'll get it in your languages as well so that everyone has the opportunity to read it. Just to end this on a more positive note, despite everything Seema just said right now, this is probably still today the best time to be Jewish in the last 2,000 years. And that's what's shocking about it. We've been battling anti-Semitism, and it feels like it's spreading so fast and it's so dangerous and so scary. But for the first time, we have our own country, we have our own army, we have our own government. This is actually the renaissance of the Jewish people. And so despite how terrible it seems that there's such a virus, anti-Semitism is spreading so fast, this is really the best we've ever had in the last 2,000 years, and we have to thank God for that as well. So we have a lot of work to do to combat anti-Semitism, and that's why we're focusing this plenum on this, and that's why we're honored to be a partner of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. But as people of faith, we have to be happy for the fact that God is with us and we have the state of Israel. This conference is always focused on Israel-related issues. It's always focused on how to support Israel. But because of the timing of the conference, I think it would be a huge mistake not to speak about what's happening in the Ukraine. The Ukraine-Russian conflict has dominated not just the news cycle and the political conversation, but most of people's hearts. I think it's hard to see the pictures of what's happening. It's hard to understand the gravity of the situation. So for us, it was very important that we decided to put a panel of some of our chairmen from across Europe who are living with this in Europe, who are affected by it directly or indirectly. And I'd like to call the panel to come up. We're going to switch the 10 cards here. Sharon, if you could put the new names here now. I want to call up Mark Pritchard, the chairperson of the British Parliamentary Israelite Caucus. I'd like to call Peter Ostman, the chairperson of the Finnish Parliamentary Israelite Caucus. I'd like to call Lars Andersson. I can always say the name. And I can't even say when I hear it. It's so hard. The Swedish chair from the Swedish Parliament, and Mr. Kremski from the Slovakian Parliament to come up here. What we're going to do is we're going to give each one a chance to come up and make a 5 to 7 minute statement about what they feel is going on, how it's affecting their countries. Also to mention that we have people who are experts in this. I believe that, Mark, you are the co-chair or deputy chair of the Ukraine Caucus, chairman of the Ukrainian Caucus in the British Parliament. Also, Peter is the chair of the Ukrainian Caucus in his parliament. So they're inundated with questions. I know we have a lot of questions, and we're not 100% on everything that's going on. So we're going to ask you to come up and do 5 to 7 minute presentation, and then we'd like to open it up to questions to not just the delegates who are here, but maybe the media if they have questions as well who are here with us. So please, we'll start with Member of Parliament Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Josh, ladies and gentlemen. The remarks I'm making today are in a personal capacity. I'm from the governing party, but these are personal perspectives on what is happening in Ukraine. And given that I'm here in Israel, I do think that it's an opportunity to try and make some observations within that context as well. And as we heard this morning from the minister, I'm aware of some of the sensitivities concerning Russia, particularly around the Syria issue, and also more widely on Iran and what Russia may or may not do. And I'd like to put on record my thanks for what the government of Israel and the people of Israel are doing to try and negotiate a peace between Ukraine and Russia. But personally, I would contend that any Israeli government of whatever political persuasion should perhaps avoid being tempted or tempted by temptation to see Russia as somebody, as a partner that can be trusted, and or see Russia as half a reliable partner. I think for Israel, Russia is and will continue to be an unreliable partner. The Russian state, Putin, does not have, I would suggest, the best interests of Israel within its beating heart. Israel must call out evil when it sees it. And I'm grateful, as we heard this morning, that field hospitals will be deployed to Ukraine, and I hope the, should we say, internal discussions about the funding of that and when more medical support will be given will be expedited by the current government as quickly as possible. And we've heard a lot about the history of Israel today and the stand that this country has made on so many important global issues. And I would suggest, respectfully, that this is not a time for Israel to be sitting on the fence, at worst, or at best, neutrality. Neutrality on this issue, when most of the world has decided to take a stand. Israel cannot be on the sidelines. And in providing Ukraine with important defensive military equipment, such as helmets and armored body armor, I think Israel can come into the mainstream and to do its bit more quickly and more effectively. We've heard a lot, as I say, about history, the past. We've heard about the future of Israel. But today, I would suggest, today is when history is being written. And Israel needs to choose its side of history when it comes to Ukraine. I'd argue that this is a seminal moment in Israel's modern history. A choice to stand for freedom and democracy. And of course, Ukraine is not NATO's border. It is not European Union's border. It is not Israel's border. But I would suggest it is freedom's border. It is freedom's front line. And Israel, of course, knows about defending freedom and democracy as the only democracy in this region. And on the issue of refugees, and there is no other country in the world that knows more about refugees than Israel. I would argue in a personal capacity there should be no cap on refugees. There is no cap in the United Kingdom. And as the Minister suggested this morning, the UK needs to do more and is doing more on refugees. But I'd argue that there should be no cap on refugees, whether they be Jew or non-Jew. This is about our common humanity and supporting our fellow human beings around the world. There should be no discrimination. And I'm not sure whether Putin has privately threatened Israel, but I go further, and I know this is controversial, but Israel's foreign policy under any government, any political persuasion, any coalition, should not be guided by bullies in the region, but should be guided by this nation, founding principles, shared international values, and a need for consistency. Israel knows more about conflict than probably any other nation on earth, knows more about refugees than probably any other place on earth. This is a time for Israel
to step up, to show leadership, and to join the international community in making a stand against international terror, I would argue. Even genocide, which I know is a controversial word to be used, but if you look at the legal definition of the charters, I think the evidence speaks for itself, hence the applications by many countries to the International Criminal Court. Thank you for what Israel's doing. Thank you for what the government here is doing. What I suggest is I think you should be doing far more. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the parliament in Finland has approximately 40 friendships groups with different countries. I have been chairman to the Finland-Israel Friendship Group for 7 years now. Many colleagues has told me that it looks like the Finland-Israel Friendship Group is the very most active group in the parliament. I used to answer them, this is due to that many international institutions like United Nations, Amnesty, and several other pushes me and my colleagues to stand up for Israel. But during the last weeks, there has been a change in this balance. 3 years ago, when I was appointed chair of the Ukrainian Friendship Group, I could never, ever imagine what would take place today in 2022. Russia's attack on Ukraine is one of the greatest human tragedies since the Second World War. Although a parliamentary friendship group is just a kind of an unofficial network, today I find myself in the midst of the crisis. The phone calls and emails from diplomats, colleagues, NGOs has been of a huge number. It has been almost a 24/7 job. I have been part of coordinating humanitarian aid, helping refugees crossing the border to Poland, and helping people also to look for safety in my country. But then back to a quick overview of the history of my own country, Finland, and what the crisis means for us. Finland is the EU country with the longest border with Russia at 1,340 kilometers. Finland used to be a part, I know that my colleague to the right, he loves this. Finland used to be part of the Swedish kingdom. But let's talk hockey here. But then during the war between Russia and Sweden, 1809, Finland was lost, remained a Grand Duchy in the Russian Empire until 1917. The October Revolution in 1917 turned Finnish politics upside down. Worried by developments in Russia and Finland, the non-socialist Senate declared Finland's independence on December 6, 1917. During the Second World War, Finland fought 2 wars against the Soviet Union, the Winter War in 1939 and the continuing war of 41 through 44. Thanks God, Finland retained a democratic constitution and free economy during the Cold War era. Officially claiming to be neutral, Finland lay in the gray zone between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. In 1995, Finland joined the European Union along with Austria and Sweden. In addition to the fast integration with the EU, safety against Russian leverage has been increased by building a fully NATO-compatible military. Finland has also opposed energy projects that increase dependency on Russian imports. At the same time, Finland has remained as one of the last non-NATO members. Finland is one of the few European nations not to have ended conscription or cut defense spending sharply after the Cold War. Today we are thankful for that. We have a huge reserve of military forces, and they are trained reservists, one of the largest in Europe. If Finland called in all its backups, that would be almost 1 million soldiers. If there is an escalation of the war in Ukraine, it would have a huge impact on everybody in Europe. Joining NATO for Finland is one of the two main alternatives to Finland's current position inside the EU but outside a military alliance. The other option is deepening of our defense cooperation with the United States and Sweden. Last week, for the first time, a majority of Finns want to join NATO. A poll stated by broadcaster Yle last week found that 62% were in favor and only 16% against. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is upending decades of thinking about security in Finland and Sweden as people in two Nordic nations see what is happening to a fellow non-NATO European country like Ukraine. Are we scared? Yes and no. At least we are awake and aware of the critical situation. And Finland's government is now preparing a white paper on security options, including potential NATO membership. The Finnish parliament is set to make a decision on whether to apply for it in the coming months. Dear friends, I will finish by quoting a prayer for Ukraine. Pray for Ukraine. Pray like it's your country. Pray like it's your home. Pray like it's your family. Pray like it's your children. Dear friends, Ukraine needs prayers and support. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be here. I will try to somehow give the Swedish or Scandinavian perspective on the very tragic events that is going on right now, not far from our country actually. Let me start by be very clear. There is no conflict going on between Ukraine and Russia. There is no war going on between Ukraine and Russia. There is a Russian aggression against Ukraine. There is a Russian military invasion of Ukraine. I think it's important to get that straight. And I think it's also important to see that aside of Iran and China, Russia today poses the most serious threat to international peace and security. There is no doubt what Vladimir Putin and his regime is capable of. We can see it now, and we have seen it before. The attack on Georgia 2008, the killings in eastern Ukraine 2014, and the annexation of Crimea, that was the beginning of the aggression and the war that we now are witnessing. The invasion of Ukraine and the brutal abuses against the Ukrainian people constitutes war crimes and serious violations of humanitarian law. At the same time, the European Security Order and the basic conditions for common security are being challenged. An independent state is suppressed. The fundamental right of free nations to decide on their own destiny, their own security policy, must be subordinated to a Russian so-called sphere of influence. And make no mistake, Putin does not hide his intentions. He wants to weaken the European Union and NATO. He wants to put a stop to further countries joining these organizations, and he wants to complete his plans for a new Russian empire. That's it. So what we see today is not only a threat to Ukraine, it's not a threat limited to this country. Russia threatens Europe in its entirety. Therefore, it's important that the responsibility is placed where it belongs. Not with free countries which want to join NATO, but with the criminals in the Kremlin. Equally important, in fact, is in fact that member states of European Union and as well as NATO remain united in their support for the Ukrainian people and in their condemnation of Russia. Is there ever a time, I would say, when EU members should stand together and speak with one voice when it comes to foreign policy? That time is now. In the Swedish Parliament, my party, the Christian Democratic Party, have been working over the years for a full membership within NATO. We have welcomed the bilateral defense cooperations that we have with Finland, with the US, and also with the UK. But at the same time, have we emphasized the need for a full membership, since there are no guarantees of outside assistance from the position we have right now. In this situation, as non-members of NATO, we are in the same situation actually. If we are attacked militarily, we are in the same situation as Ukraine today. For these reasons, and for other reasons as well, Sweden should have been a member of NATO for a long time ago. Political inability and division within the biggest party in Sweden, the Social Democrats, have, however, blocked this issue. When it comes to risks today, I would say that you don't need advanced analytical ability to say that the big risk today is to stand alone as a nation. The invasion of Ukraine teaches us that an individual nation can have the support from the whole world, but still end up alone in the fight against a ruthless aggressor. We have a new security situation in Europe after February 24, which is illustrated among other things by the fact that the Russian regime has now openly been talking about Sweden and Finland as parts of their sphere of interests. In the same spirit, statements are made that Sweden and Finland, if those countries apply for membership in NATO, that would lead to political and military reactions from Russia. The message is clear. Putin puts a stop for further enlargement of NATO. Against this background, a clarification of Sweden's position is necessary, and it's needed. And we are working now very rapid, and we are working very cautiously in order to try to achieve at least closer cooperation with NATO, but hopefully a full membership as soon as possible. And we're working very closely, as my friend Peter just said, we are working very close between Sweden and Finland. So this is the situation from a Swedish perspective. It's a really serious situation. We are in a new situation, a difficult situation where we need to cooperate. And I would like to thank the Israeli government for the mediation efforts. I think it's crucial, it's important, and I think that we can stand together in these days as democracies for the Ukrainian people and for what's right and for freedom and democracy and for the European security order. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I would like to introduce for you who are not very familiar with relations in Europe, especially in Central Europe, the situation, what we feel and what we see in relation with this terrible aggression in Ukraine. Central Europe is a part of the world where many wars happened in the past, and we are a small state. Slovakia is the one of the smallest, 5.5 million, and together with our neighbors in Central Europe, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and other former communist states, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, Baltic states, we are really on the border with former Soviet Union, now with Ukraine. My colleagues mentioned that Russia is an unreliable partner, and it's really true, because we have our experience with former Soviet Union, with this prison of the nations, how we call it, and the breakdown of Soviet Union was very unexpected in 90s, 91, 92, and nowadays Vladimir Putin, as a long-time president of Russia, is building a Russian empire. These dreams of Russian empire are behind this aggression against Ukraine. Russia has become a totalitarian state in the last 20 years. In the 90s it was so-called democracy, more or less. But in the last 20 years it became a real totalitarian state, where people are not allowed to express their meanings and their beliefs. And this is leading to intolerance. In Russia, they call it nutsballs. They love shortages, and nutsball is shortage for Nazist and Bolsheviks. It's very interesting combination of these two terrible philosophies, and it it's well known that in Russia the anti-Semitism is very strong, and racism as well, especially against the people from Caucasus, because they are more dark, and these nutsballs in Russia are very, very aggressive against them, and against Jews as well. And these philosophies and these movements are supported by Russian government. This dreaming of Russian empire brings aggression or expansion again, not only against Ukraine. Ukraine is called Malorossiya, small Russia, in this Russian ideology. Against Belarus as well, it's Belarusia, it's another part of Russia. But the same against Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, Baltic states, Moldova, where many Russian-speaking people are living, and where Russian ethnics moved in times of Soviet Union. Very interesting is in this aggression against Ukraine that they are fighting against cities where the people are really Russian-speaking, and most of them Russian ethnics. And these people are fighting now against the Russian army, and or are fleeing to the west, to the western part of Ukraine. So I'm not agreeing with my colleagues when they say it's the war of the Russian army against Ukraine. It's a war of Putin regime against different people in Ukraine, and many of them are Russians. It's terrible what the war and this bad ideology brings. But this expansive, aggressive thinking ideology is aggressive against Central Europe as well, against Finland, Eastern Germany, Eastern Austria, what was under Soviet Empire in the past, or was occupied by Soviet Empire after the Second World War. And I have heard about Alaska as well, because it was part of Russia in the past. So I was listening to a talk show in Russian television. It was called Воскресенье вечером, Sunday evening, and these people was really discussing everything. When there are sanctions against us, we just can take Central Europe, we just can take Berlin, we just can take Alaska. That's no problem. It's not worth because of Ukraine. We can take everything now. So that's the range of Ukrainian war, and the Ukraine is really the barrier. When this barrier would fall, it's really big danger for Europe and for other parts of the world. On the other part, we all know that President Zelensky has a Jewish origin, and in Ukraine, his government brought big tolerance, and for example, the memorial Babin Yar, where about 100,000 people were murdered in the Second World War, was coming to the construction. Now I want to say what it's bringing for Slovakia. In Ukraine now, from 45 millions of inhabitants, 10 millions became refugees. About 5 millions now, 4 or 5 millions went abroad, but other 5 millions are waiting near to Ukrainian border to Slovakia, Poland, Romania, because they don't want to leave Ukraine. And someone mentioned here that the situation is knocking on our door, but this situation is kicking off our door in Slovakia, what we feel. So we had to open our door to to the refugees from Ukraine, and we are happy that we can help them and we can provide them and feed them. In the Slovakia, until now, 250,000 people came over the border. It's maybe not too much, but if you know that it's 5% of inhabitants of Slovakia, it's not really a few. Maybe 80% from these people went to other countries, Czech Republic, Poland, Austria, Germany, and 20% stayed in Slovakia. Many of them are living in families, in special foundations, centers, in state buildings, in refugee camps. We have hotspots on the border where they can registrate. They have right to health care, or they have right to work with this status. And on the borders are another 5 or more million people. When these people went over the border, it's really very hard in whole Central Europe. So the help from other countries is really necessary. I would like to mention Jewish refugees, especially from Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, where they lived in big communities. There are hotspots on the borders, and I have information about the refugees who became help in Bratislava. Many of them want to go to Warsaw to fly to Israel, but some of them are staying in Bratislava, for example, what is very good to or hope for them, because the community in Bratislava is very elderly. Many people have over 80 years, and they are hope to refresh the community, and that the younger people will come and stay. So what we can do for Ukraine? Just open our hearts for war refugees. I think it's always not easy when the people are fleeing and streaming to our country, but it's very important to recognize that this is time to help. This is not time to ask many questions. It's time to help. Support Ukraine, pray for Ukraine, and stand behind Ukraine. It's very important, because the language which President Putin is understanding, and all these Bolsheviks are understanding, is power. They need to see that we are united and strong. That's what they understand. Help people, especially Jews in Alaya, maybe to settle in Central Europe and build up the communities in Central Europe, and as well combat anti-Semitism in Europe and support Israel, because this anti-Semitism is a very strong signal that the tolerance has problems. That's what makes me sad, that we can see now more anti-Semitism in Paris or in London as in Warsaw or in Bratislava. And I hope that we will be a good example how to live in tolerance with different people, different religions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists for those remarks. I think it's interesting to see a different perspective from each one of your countries. If there are questions that you'd like to ask, we'll open it up to questions about some of the remarks that they made, or in general about the conflict. We'll start with the Member of Parliament from Kenya, Richard Tangi.
Thank you, the leadership, and the wonderful presentation. As you've been told, my name is Richard Tangi from Kenya. Kenya sits in the UN Security Council, representing Africa today. And our ambassador in the UN Security Council spoke so strongly on and in support of Ukraine. And I'm wondering, as the chairman of Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, is there anything that we can do to support in our small way to ensure that there's order and the things are done in a better way to ensure the safety of the people of Ukraine? Because we come from the background where we believe that insecurity in Ukraine is insecurity everywhere. And all of us cannot just sit back and watch and keep hoping that a miracle is going to happen unless we do our small contribution. And now that we are speaking of religious issues, I'm reminded of what Mother Teresa said. Mother Teresa, and I quote, that if all of us can clean the front of our houses, the entire world will be a very clean environment to live in. Most of the times the evil thrive on account that we sit back and say, it's not for me. Yeah, it's not for me to do that. But if in a small way we can do something to ensure that there's a clear message to Russia that what is happening today will easily go to another country and hence become a global issue, I think the time is now. And in our small way, if there's anything we can do from Kenya, by virtue of the office we occupy today in the Security Council, we'll be very grateful to do it. And I'm not speaking on behalf of Kenya, but by virtue of the office that I occupy, I'm sure I can be able to propagate and pass on the message to a higher level beyond me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Lars, you can take the question is, what can Kenya do, being in the Security Council and also Richard being chair of the Foreign Relations Committee? Is there something that Kenya and Africa can do in this?
Thank you.
This one. Open it.
1, 2. Okay. Thank you so much for the question, dear colleague. I can start, answer, and then hand over to my colleagues. On this note, I think it's important to see different perspectives. I mean, Russia is a veto nation within the Security Council, and so far they have vetoed almost everything, or everything, which has been on the table. So it's not easy to use the Security Council in these situations as an effective tool. But still, I think if we see the war going on from a humanitarian perspective, there are a lot of things that the UN can do. I know, for instance, that there is an urgent need for so-called humanitarian corridors where civilians trapped in different situations need to get a possibility to get out, frankly. And there is also need for a ceasefire in order to get the humanitarian organizations to come in and do their work and give assistance. So I think this is an area where it's important to push within the UN system and also within the Security Council to ease the situation somehow for the suffering civilians. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions, and I don't have much to add to my colleagues. Lars, good answer. Just saying that, of course, different countries has different levels of resources when it comes to economic resources and so on. So we cannot demand from every and each country all over the world that they would be ready to deliver weapons or lots of donations or clothes or food, because we are in different situations. But the best advice that I could give Kenya is that during the Second World War, our lovely neighbors Sweden, although they hate us in hockey, but when it comes to war, they proclaimed, Finland's sake is our sake. So I would say in this situation, Ukraine's sake in ours sake.
Thank you. I just wanted to say specifically on the UN, I think that many countries rightly use the General Assembly to assert their government's position, and perhaps more countries need to use the UN Security Council route in supporting, co-sponsoring certain motions and resolutions. I think that would add more weight specifically to the survival of Ukraine.
Other questions? Yes, Darren from Wales.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the panelists for your contributions. I just wanted to ask... Is that better?
Yes.
I just wanted to make one comment, if I may, and then put a question particularly to my colleague from the UK, Mark Pritchard, MP. The first comment is, obviously, Vladimir Putin said that his stated aim was to discourage Ukraine from joining NATO. One of his stated aims for the invasion of Ukraine was for that purpose. And of course, what it's actually done is undermined his position, because you now have Finland, Sweden and other nations rushing to join NATO and wanting to accelerate their paths to become members of that very successful military alliance. So it'd be interesting to get feedback from the panel on the progress that's being made, perhaps if you've got some further information on that. And just in terms of Mark Pritchard's comments, you made reference to the need for Israel to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and the international community in the West that have been standing up for freedom. I think that as allies of Israel here today, it's really important that that message comes from this chairman's conference, because we stand with Israel. We want Israel to stand with us in standing against this terrible aggression from Russia. I've been encouraged in recent days to hear comments from Yair Lapid as the Foreign Minister of Israel, that's been standing up, very clearly articulating his position. But obviously it's a very broad coalition in Israel at the moment, and I appreciate it can sometimes be difficult to have one voice when you have a very broad coalition of the sort that Israel currently has. How do you see that coalition navigating this issue, Mark, given that, unfortunately, because of Israeli politics, there's not a strong single-party system like the one that we have in the UK?
I'll take it last.
No, it's you, Mark.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I think any leader of any party managing a coalition, probably any answers, please send on a postcard, because I don't think it's easy for any country in any government in coalition. But the point that I was making, and I'm here as a friend of Israel, and I think friendship sometimes is about appreciating candid friends. I don't speak for the British government, but I said they were personal perspectives. But right now, cruise missiles are falling on the Ukrainian population. There's probably 200,000 Jewish people. There may even be Russian Jews living in Ukraine. But those missiles aren't discriminating between Jew and non-Jew. And whilst I'm grateful for the government of Israel, coalition government, providing medical support, although I think they should be providing more, I think more could be done to provide protective, armoured, plated, personal gear. It doesn't even have to go to the military. It can go to emergency. This is a country, we heard yesterday, there's some ambulances are armoured ambulances. They could provide armoured ambulances. That isn't offensive, lethal. So I think there's a lot more that can be done whilst recognising what has already been done. But specifically on your point about coalitions, whatever the coalition, I made my points earlier about whoever was in government, whatever the coalition, these are international principles that we're talking about freedom and democracy and the common humanity that we share, whether Jew or non-Jew. There was a direct appeal from the president of Ukraine yesterday, and I don't think that appeal can be
easily ignored. This is a moment in modern history for Israel to choose what it says it believes in, fundamentally in this region. It cannot park its conscience outside of the region on the issue of freedom and democracy. It either exists or it doesn't, inherently within this nation, and I believe it does, across the political divide. And that is why this is decision hour for this government, all of the coalition, all of the Knesset, all of the political parties, because it cannot be turned on and off, freedom and democracy, and countries chosen for whatever reason in the future. This is a moment of decision. More needs to be done whilst recognizing what has already been done. Thank you.
One last question, if we have, for the panel. Oh, sure, please.
I just wanted to add that I think it's critically important what you are raising from my British friends here. I think this is an issue that we have to deal with in our countries. I have got the questions as a friend of Israel, got questions about this as a friend of Israel and a well-known pro-Israeli supporter in my context, in my country. So we need to address it. And I think the way to address it is this. It is to be frank and to be open and to say that from our out from our love for Israel, we want Israel to be on our side and to take a stand which is clear and which is very, very important, I would say, in this situation. So just want to add this. And when it comes to NATO, your second question, I would like to say that we hope for some kind of fast track to NATO. There are signals that it might go quite swift if we are applying. Since we are a partner country today, we are coordinated, we have common exercises and so on and so forth. So it's not to start from the beginning, the day when we make the decision. So hopefully it will be a reality as soon as possible. I don't know if Peter would say something.
Let's say like this. Finland is a country of freedom and democracy. We stand for freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, and when it comes to whether we are joining NATO or not, we will do our decision independent what a third party is saying. We are a friendly neighbor. Lars knows it, Russians knows it. We are not attacking anybody, but we have the right to defend our country.
Can I just, add one other thing which I should have mentioned earlier, and that is, for me, the overarching sort of principle on all of this, or the red flag, I should say, on all of this, is surely Putin's comment some weeks ago when he said, to paraphrase, he does not believe in the right of Ukraine to exist. Surely this is a country that understands that terminology. We've heard it before on Iran. If Israel is not going to do more, then I think it will go down in the history books as a missed opportunity for Israel to actually back up what I do believe it stands for, and it should stand for, in this crisis, in this time. Not always looking back, not always looking forward, but writing its history, modern history, in the global context today.
I think that, sorry, just as a last, the time is up, so just a final comment by Mr.
Okay, I just want to say that we as Slovakia, as a small country, we have to fight for our existence, for on our existence for hundreds of years. We have been part of Austrian-Hungary Empire, part of Czechoslovakia, part of Communist Empire. And we are part of NATO from 2004, and we are very happy to be.
Well, thank you. That was a candid discussion on the issues going on in Ukraine. We pray for the peace of Ukraine. We pray for the people of Ukraine. And as people of faith, I don't think anyone can look at what's going on there and not be horrified. So I think that there's a call for action. Obviously, this isn't what the Israel Allies Foundation does on a regular basis. We're about mobilizing faith-based support for Israel, but also we can't turn a blind eye to the suffering going on of our allies and in nations around. I will say that I'm surprised to hear that a lot of people don't believe that Israel is doing a lot in this, because from an Israeli point of view, Israel has really stepped up. They tried to mediate, and they're trying to mediate a peaceful agreement, but at the same time, they have not stopped by condemning the atrocities in Ukraine. And I believe, other than any other country that borders with Ukraine, we've actually taken more refugees than any other country on the planet from Ukraine. So I think that there's always more that can be done, and it's a sensitive time. It's also a time where, unfortunately, the United States and Russia are working together on signing a deal with our mortal enemy, Iran, that's developing a nuclear weapon. So that's something that we're obviously keeping an eye on. But it's definitely a dangerous time, and whatever we can do, we should be doing. So I want to thank our panel. I want to thank the delegates. We're going to have lunch now. It's right behind here through this door. If you can sit at your tables by continent, we want the European delegation to sit together, the African delegation to sit together, and the Latin American delegation to sit together, because we're going to have people come to your table and speak to you about different things as we go through the lunch. And then following the lunch, just for the members, again, only the members of Parliament, we will be taking the bus to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to meet with Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. Thank you.